Good evening.
Hi, how you doing, Dwayne? Glad you could make it. I wasn't sure if anyone would come, but
Well, well, it just worked out that tonight would work for me. Um, I always have to stop and think, that's 7 p.m., that's 7 p.m. Eastern time. And I always got to check on that. Do we have, I can't hear you. I'm not able to hear you. I have my volume. My volume is working here.
I've got.
Okay, I can hear you now, but not now. I can't hear anything.
What about now?
Okay, now I can, yes.
Good. Okay.
Okay.
That's weird.
Yeah, something somewhere. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So where are you from again, Dwayne?
Northeast Iowa.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sure. Yeah. All right.
In the upper Midwest, and they have 2 inches of snow forecast for tomorrow night.
Yeah, we got a little bit of snow ourselves today. A little bit more in the outer suburbs than we did in DC itself, but we got a little bit. Got kind of a dusting and then some kind of a wintry mix after that.
Well, we're all scared out here as to what we're going to have for winter because we've had a very wet summer and fall.
Does that herald a really snowy winter?
We're afraid it is.
Yeah.
Well, we're just afraid of that. Maybe not.
Right.
But we'll know more in 3 months.
Right.
But yeah, we've had a lot of rain out here, and we just hope that that doesn't materialize into snow. But anyway, what happens, happens. God knows what's best.
Exactly. So that's good. So, well, good. I don't know if anyone else is going to join us, but I guess we can get started. I think you can hear me now, so I'm gonna mosey on over to the fridge and get a drink here while we're talking here. So anyway, how are you doing this week? And we met last week, didn't we?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. So what I tried to do this week was give everyone a little bit of a flavor of how the controversies that we've been looking at, when they began impacting the church, and that, happened. That's really been happening all along, but it especially happened in the 19th century.
Yes.
Especially, from the time of Pius the Ninth and after, because the inroads were critical methods were making into Bible study. Obviously, the church can't really exist in a hermetically sealed world forever, and sooner or later there's a lot of Catholics who are going to be interested in the Bible too, regardless of what the posture of the church is, because it is the Word of God. And so you have different sort of responses to the to the rise of criticism as criticism, biblical criticism, and different methods of biblical criticism, which we've seen mean a variety of different things, right? That all of these were beginning to sort of impact the church. And one response to that was the modernist movement. And that really kind of got going in the 1870s or so, 1860s, 1870s, kind of after the Civil War in the U.S., but probably more in Europe. So, around the time of the rise of Kaiser, Bismarck and that sort of thing in Germany, and the rise of Napoleon III in France, and so Louis Napoleon, and so the controversy really kind of got going there, and so the issues pretty much revolved around the same things that we've kind of looked at in terms of a better knowledge of the text based on all the findings of the various manuscripts that had been kind of overflowing into the knowledge of the scholarly community. And the existence of these texts sort of cast further doubt on more ancient translations that were derived from the Latin, which in turn had been corrected many times throughout history, but really went back to Jerome's translation of Greek that was available to him. That text began to look a little bit more suspect, actually a lot more suspect in terms of the various findings of what the ancient church was actually reading at the time. And so that became something that needed to be responded to. The various movements that we've looked at in terms of form criticism was a big one. Depended on a very, very rigorous study of the ancient language of the Bible, particularly Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament. And although there certainly were Catholics in the 19th century who knew Hebrew and Greek, you would probably, if you were being instructed at sort of a priestly level, have been trained in Latin primarily and nothing more than that. So there was a little bit of a language deficit as well, and that made it really, really difficult to sort of counter the various Protestant theories. The fact that many of the church were working still in the Vulgate or vernacular translations that were derived from the Vulgate, and the sort of lack of language made responding to these to these sorts of movements difficult. And so really the big response to that started in 1893 with Pope Leo and the encyclical Providentissimus Deus, which is sort of the beginning of landmark encyclical, which was the first sort of movement toward more or less grudgingly opening the church to the use of more modern methods. If you read Providentissimus, and I would certainly urge that you do, even if I'm not going to specifically quiz you on the contents of it in this course, but you should know that it exists. Providentissimus, truth be told, has a pretty negative tone to it. I mean, it's rather polemical. It's rather defensive. It tends to lash out at various unnamed critics, many of whom were modernists, by the way, but were not so called modernists. They were people like Alfred Loisy, who we looked at a little bit this week. Perhaps George Tyrrell, who we looked at as well, And there were sort of many others, as that could have fit in one form or another, the criticisms that were being made. But nevertheless, Leo did really for the first time commit the church to the legitimacy of text criticism, and that was a big push. That is to say that that the examination of the Greek manuscripts was essential, and the Hebrew manuscripts was essential, and this needed to continue. And it still was a little bit confusing why he wanted to do it, because it seemed as though it wasn't so much to gain a better knowledge of the text, but if only to clarify the sense of the Latin. So there's still a sense in Providentissimus Deus that the Latin Vulgate is still kind of the normative translation for Catholics, but it's the first sort of admission that that Greek really can and should be consulted also, and furthermore, that the study of ancient languages is very important and essential. And so one result of the upshot of Providentissimus Deus was the founding of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, as well as the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, both of which are dedicated heavily to the study of Scripture, and particularly the study of ancient languages. So these institutions have been with us since the time of the late 19th century and down to the present day. So these were sort of big steps forward in the history of biblical interpretation of the church. Hi, Sue Ellen here?
Yes, sir, I am.
Hi, Sue Ellen. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for asking. I'm fine. How about you guys?
We're doing good. We're doing good.
Good. Is that Dwayne on the other part?
Yep,
Yes,
I'm here
Dwayne.
too.
We're the two regulars.
Yeah, the Midwesterners.
Right.
That's right.
So how are you doing, Sue Ellen? Did you guys have any questions about the material this week? I'm kind of summarizing it briefly, but at least what I think is important.
I was listening. I didn't have a question per se about that, but I do have a question at some point about something I read this week when I was doing research.
Okay. Sure. Sure. Okay. Well, let me just continue the summary briefly. So there was Providentissimus, and of course Providentissimus was, sort of unevenly received because it had this sort of defensive and polemical edge to it, although it really did in some ways open the door to modern scholarship. But so like a lot of these church documents, you can kind of find in them what you want to find, and people who were looking for a sort of tools to fight against modernists or modernism found in Providentissimus some support for their position, but people who also wanted to modernize Catholic biblical scholarship also found support. So what was the modernist crisis? Do you guys remember that?
I'm sorry, did you read the question? What did you say, sir?
What was the modernist crisis? Do you remember that?
No.
Okay. Do you remember it, Sue Ellen?
I'm looking, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay, so the modernists were guys like Loisy and Tyrrell, who were very well schooled in ancient languages, had imbibed a lot of ideas from Protestant critics, like people such as we've looked at. F.C. Bauer would be one of them. Adolf von Harnack would be another one. So they imbibed a lot from them, and they kind of were people who sort of attacked the church from the other side, from sort of a position of radical skepticism of the Catholic Church's claims to be really what it is. And so they pushed for a kind of certainly a radical agenda of decentralization, of really relativizing of the authority of the magisterium, because it was thought that the magisterial teachings wouldn't really hold up to scholarly scrutiny anymore, that they were not historically well founded, that the Bible itself had many historical problems in it. That was the famous La Question Biblique that Alfred Loisy had posed, the various historical problems with the Bible, and also the degree to which biblical teaching was held to be, incompatible with science. That was another aspect to it. Both sort of evolutionary science, which had kind of recently come on the scene, but also the degree to which the sort of theological spokesmen of the church were still kind of announcing these formulas in kind of a scholastic language, sort of sounding a little bit reminiscent of the kinds of phrases that the Council of Trent had used and Thomas Aquinas, very formulaic, but they weren't really, able to engage the various, new knowledge of the Bible that had come as a result of archaeology, archaeological science, historical science, the knowledge of linguistics. And so, the modernists had traction for that regard and for that reason, that the people that they were arguing against were probably a little bit overly conservative and also were seemingly holding to things that were a little intellectually vulnerable. And so this made modernism very difficult to deal with. The modernists, like a lot of critics, you sort of had some basis for their criticism, although the kind of reforms that were needed, they were not people ideally suited to press for them, because they were much too radical in their orientation, and also much they greatly overstated the force of the various criticisms that had been launched in the 19th century, and they greatly underestimated the ability of the church. And by the church, this could mean the Catholic Church, but also just Christianity in general, to adapt its message and its presentation of itself and its self-understanding to the new knowledge that had been assembled. Right. In other words, it seemed rather dire in the late 19th century for being an intellectual Catholic, because there had been all these biblical manuscripts discovered. There have been all this new knowledge about Egyptology, Assyriology, this new knowledge about evolutionary science, that some new cosmology was coming on the scene. And the church had not adapted its teaching in any way, shape, or form to this. And it seemed like that, to some people, that the church was just kind of a house of cards that was going to collapse. And so that's kind of where the modernists were coming from. But as I say, they were right in saying that the church really did need to kind of modify itself to, address the growth of the new knowledge. And we're sort of looking at ways in this course about how that's had to happen. Like, I've kind of told you various things that, needed to be kind of tweaked and refined a little bit along the way. Like we today have a much greater appreciation of the significance of human authorship in the Bible than they certainly had in the late 19th century among sort of Catholic universities and seminaries, right? We definitely understand the importance of historical development of doctrine, right? That was an idea that was rather new in the late 19th century, but is totally accepted today. Of course, the work of Newman in some ways was in some ways a pushback against, modernism, or in some ways an answer to modernists, saying, look, Catholics can admit, okay, yeah, our faith as it's practiced today in the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, may not be exactly what was practiced in the first century, in the sense that the doctrines that we have, have a different expression, that the way we do liturgy is somewhat different, that our understanding of the papacy and church authority is much more refined. We obviously have a much better sense of the biblical text than probably some of the ancients and medievals did. So our knowledge is more refined, but nevertheless, we can definitely see an organic continuity between us and them, in the sense that what they believed is really a natural precursor to what we believe, taking into account development. But you can see, though, that from the point of view of someone like George Tyrrell or Alfred Loisy, the modernist, by the mid to late 19th century, the church really had not officially acknowledged that there had been any significant change of anything at all from the time of the apostles. And so, they were looking at this and saying, this is ridiculous. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of changes. And so, but again, so they greatly underestimated they overestimated the force of these criticisms. These criticisms were powerful, but were not going to be powerful enough to sink the church. The church really could adapt its teachings a little bit in the sense of the public presentation of them to account for the various things that were really known by the 19th century. So it's growth of science, the much greater knowledge of history, the much greater knowledge of the ancient biblical languages that had accrued, the much greater knowledge of biblical text. All of these things, were relatively new to the church by the mid late 19th century, but by the early mid 20th century, the existence was kind of taken for granted. So in other words, the church really was able to adapt to this and respond to this. And in some ways, you could think of Vatican II as kind of the big official response to a lot of the movements of modernity, right? That was the official explanation. This is a little bit later, but this is the official explanation that Pope John the 23rd gave to why the Vatican II Council was necessary. Why was it necessary? Well, the church itself, the teachings are relatively clear, but the expression of them is something else, that we really needed to express them in ways that were consistent with the way modern people talk and think and act, and was respectful of valid modern knowledge of things, right? So it didn't pretend like nothing had changed in many, many, many centuries. So, but nevertheless, there is this struggle that's in some ways always been with us and always will be with us. It's the basic struggle between the human Jesus and the divine Jesus, right? The divine Jesus wants to say Christ is the same today, tomorrow, yesterday, nothing changes, but the human Jesus does grow, change, and develop. And so that same tension between the person of Jesus, the human, and the person Jesus, the divine, is going to be played out in many ways constantly in the church as well, where there's going to be this tension between the part of the church that never changes, the essence of the church, the deposit of faith, and then the sort of lived expression of this, which is always sort of growing, developing, and very much dependent on historical contingencies in different time periods. So that's the basic struggle between the church and modernism. So the modernist crisis kind of fizzled out by the 1920s, 1930s, right? That the key modernist had died off, and and there was sort of a tacit movement in a lot of low-level places where scholars were exploring different ideas a little bit more, and in some ways we know now in retrospect laying the groundwork for Vatican II. So and we could see Vatican II in some ways as very much the answer to all the at least the intellectual framework for the answer to all the various movements that we've been looking at, specifically about the Bible, and this would be the rise of the modern biblical criticism, and the various forms that it's taken. So that's a nice little 10, 15-minute summary. I hope that makes sense. And then, so what questions do you have for me?
When I read this week's lesson, and I'm going to mispronounce Alfred's last name, Loisy,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Loisy, and read those 5 points there that he said regarding, and then that he was actually not well received. It just really struck me so odd. I had to reread through that, because these are all things that we just take for granted today.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's the thing that's kind of weird about it, right? So you look back in the modernists and say, so what was the actual issue here? Like it seems like things were sort of uncontroversial, right? Like the idea that the knowledge of doctrine is historically conditioned, right? I mean, that's we kind of take that for granted. Well, the problem is that in the context of these guys advancing this, that it seemed a lot like their agenda was sort of a Trojan horse, right? That sometimes what happens in real life is that you don't really attack the ideas that your enemies are actually advancing, but you sort of surmise their broader motivations, and you see that their motivations are unacceptable, and that sort of forces you to attack their ideas, right? This happens all the time in politics, right? I mean, you're a Republican and Democrat fighting over the healthcare system, right? The Republicans are afraid that we're going to have some kind of national health care, which is going to jack up taxes. And so they tend to make defenses of the healthcare system that are a little, kind of ignore a lot of the problems, because if they concede the problems, then they're conceding the broader framework and motivation of the people who are attacking the problems, and they see their motivations as unacceptable. And so that's kind of why you don't make any progress in the debate. And when you look at Loisy as a person, just going back to his example, and Tyrrell, these guys, were having a real faith crisis themselves, right? I mean, so they were advancing these things at the same time that they had, they were not able to integrate their scholarship into their personal faith life and stuff. And people knew this, right? So they knew that they were having difficulty being Catholic in any sort of meaningful sense of the term, and being anyway loyal to the Pope. It had not really, no one had yet figured out a way to kind of be, to sort of reinterpret the faith enough so that they could hold on to a traditional faith structure and at the same time, be amenable to sort of modern knowledge. And so Loisy, was having this sort of existential crisis of faith, and basically ended up leaving the church entirely. Tyrrell, was writing these sort of vitriolic attacks, against the Holy Father. And so it's kind of like, you look at these guys, and if you just look at sort of what they were bothered by, you see that what they were bothered by made a lot of sense, but they were not really the ideal people to make these sort of, complaints, because they were not really faithful sons of the church. That was sort of the problem. And so what needed to really happen was we needed sort of more time for things to stew, and you needed to have people sort of figure out ways to be faithful, loyal Catholics, loyal to the Holy Father, believing what the church believes, and also, being able to do modern scholarship and not see necessarily, maybe see some tensions between those things, but not see that one has to be exchanged for the other, right? So, and it took several, a couple more generations for kind of a scholarly movement to come about that could do that. In some ways, the famous Nouvelle Theologie guys were guys like this, right? That was sort of their stock and trade, that they were people who could be in dialogue with modern scholarship, but could also be faithful Catholics. And once those guys came about, like Danielou and de Lubac and Ignace del Poterie and Hansard von Balthasar, all these kind of guys who came about in the 50s, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, probably the 40s and 50s. Once the church kind of saw that these guys could use modern methods and still seem relatively Catholic, that was one of the things that kind of convinced the church that, okay, maybe we really need to rethink this whole thing and open the door a little bit more, because these guys have shown that unlike the modernists, these guys have shown that they can still be good, solid Catholics and advance the kingdom, but also be, in dialogue with the most recent forms of knowledge. So that's kind of the answer I would have for you on that one. I often wondered that myself, It's like when I first looked at the modernists, I said, gosh, am I a modernist? Because these are things I feel like I believe. So, but you kind of realize that once you look at the whole package in the historical context, these guys, these guys really almost had to be opposed, right? There was almost no choice but to oppose them because, they just they just weren't faithful enough to the church really to be the people launching any kind of a new movement, right? And that was sort of the problem. Their Catholic bona fides have been lost.
Well, it's interesting because didn't you mention something similar with Martin Luther? Didn't he have a personal situation where his faith was basically tested, and that's kind of what put him to the point where he felt like he had to reform everything?
Right, exactly. So yeah, if Luther had remained in the church, right, and figured out a way to advance his reforms remaining in the church, he might have gone down in history as a great saint, right? So
right.
A lot of things aren't really how you believe so much; it's the context in which you believe them, and whether you're ultimately you don't cave into pride or despair, and you actually stick within the structure, and you still suffer a lot of abuse and suffering that way, but that can be a real source of sanctification for you and ultimately the benefit of the church. So someone who was sort of accused of being a modernist, who we looked at briefly, is Joseph Marie Lagrange. Was someone who was a faithful exegete, was a solid Catholic, but of course was accused of being a modernist, and that was in some ways the particular cross he had to bear. But he was sort of an early pioneer of modern scholarship, and showing that that not only could a good Catholic be a modern scholar that's attuned to the current state of the human knowledge, and not having to pretend like all the the new knowledge over the past 200 or 300 years was just didn't exist, but also do that and be a good solid Catholic and a faithful Catholic. So exactly, that was sort of the problem with Luther. If Luther had figured out a way to push for his reforms in the church, we would probably think of him very differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How it is. But when I was doing some research on him, I read something, and I was going to ask you if this was true or just somebody's opinion, but they talked about how when he translated the Bible into German, that basically that started more of a German universal language, because before it had been a bunch of dialects, and he just kind of pulled it all together to make it almost
that's probably right. Yeah. So I don't know that much about the history of German, but I do. My understanding is that there was not a whole lot of written German before Luther, and so the Luther Bible was very important in the development of sort of a unified German language.
Oh, I see. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, there's no doubt that was important. And of course, if you know anything about the history of Germany, Germany itself kind of emerged from in the 19th century from sort of a mess of various little kingdoms and duchies and cities and stuff like that. And so out of the kind of chaotic Holy Roman Empire, which famously was said neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, it was mostly Germany. It was mostly just kind of a bizarre collection of states, and it was kind of pulled together through the through the leadership of the Kaisers. But Luther was sort of instrumental in that, in sort of standardizing the German language a little bit. Yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, thank you. That helps me.
Yep. So just laying more of the groundwork for Vatican II was one kind of big movement along the way was the 1943 encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu, and you should know that as well. At least know what it is.
Yeah.
This was by Pius XII, released during World War II. It took a much more positive tone toward modern scholarship. It was deliberately published 50 years after Providentissimus Deus of Leo had been released. So it kind of on the surface agreed with Providentissimus, but in many ways, Providentissimus had a kind of a defensive and polemical tone to it. But Divino, if you read it, you'll notice a big difference in the tone. If anything, there's sort of a mild anti-conservative tone to a Divino that it mildly sort of chastised people in the 40s who were kind of a mind to resist anything new in biblical studies because, you know, we've already got the fathers and the doctors. What else could we add to that? And Pius was saying that's kind of ridiculous because we know a lot more than they did. And so although we definitely, you know, need to learn from them and stand on their shoulders, it's crazy to think that we can't add anything to what their best efforts gave us. So that encyclical in many ways paved the way for Dei Verbum and intellectually. And you will notice a lot of continuity between that document and Dei Verbum. And there's, you know, Dei Verbum frequently cites Divino in its presentation of the church's teaching on Scripture.
We talked about both of those earlier in the semester, and so this helps kind of bring that back together. And
right. So we're sort of circling around. That's right. So we're kind of coming back slowly to where we started in the course.
Well, I was anxious to get both of these encyclicals printed out and read them because I had been hearing about them, and so I was kind of looking forward to it when I could read them. And I highlighted quite a few things in both.
Right.
Now, do you think that maybe the situation with Alfred Loisy and Tyrrell would have been a whole lot different if we'd have had these two encyclicals a whole lot earlier?
Oh, sure. Yeah. You know, maybe they would have figured out a way to, maybe they would have claimed vindication. Who knows? But the problem is both guys were kind of losing their faith, and that was sort of the underlying problem with both of them, right? And you know, it's sad in a way. Maybe they would have been able to hold on to their faith if they had been born
right
50 years later than they were.
You know, if you're coming up with ideas that the church is against, I think it's kind of natural to start to reject the church anytime somebody disagrees with you.
Right, exactly, and that is a problem, right? There is an intellectual hazard to any advanced study of theology, because there's always a chance that if you really get into it, you know, you might come to a conclusion that's different than what the church is. You know, that can happen. I mean, I don't think that happens terribly often, but it does happen. So. You know, and I will say, but the culture of biblical scholarship is a little bit different than the culture of, say, people that do moral theology, that like moral theologians, or, you know, if you just look at the way like theologians are, or say systematic theologians, the culture of biblical scholarship is kind of a little bit more. They'll listen to the magisterium, but there's kind of a sense in which, you know, they kind of are a little more independent. They're a little bit more ornery. They're a little bit more, you know, just wanting to kind of reformulate things and reframe things, and so that they tend to be a little bit less conservative than guys that do systematics or guys that do historical theology. And moral theologians could be conservative. You know, most of the liberal ones, I think, have kind of died off. I don't think there's, you know, that field has definitely gotten a lot more conservative in the past 20, 30 years. But biblical scholars are a little bit different just culturally. If you kind of talk to one extensively, you'll see, you know, the way that they sort of relate to church documents is a little bit different than the way moral theologians do. Or systematicians do, but that in some way is due to the fact that you know, when you're doing theology from the Bible, you're kind of doing it in a way that you know, you're looking at the text a lot more granularly and a lot, you know, more closely than you know, sometimes other people do. So you tend to see things that others don't, and you also have more trouble seeing things that others do because, you know, you're sort of caught up more in the complexity. So these sort of easy connections that people make between, this verse and that particular theological idea, that's something that a Bible scholar usually would not quite take as for granted, and would say, you got to really demonstrate that a little bit more and show how that developed into that. So at any rate, that's kind of how, Dei Verbum happened in Vatican II. And then, of course, we did a little bit after Vatican II. I think I had you read that too, didn't I? Did I have you read anything after Vatican II? Did I tell you about the 1993 document, Interpretation of the Bible in the Church?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
All right, what year? Maybe I have the wrong one.
1993.
It was the one from Ratzinger's comment.
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Ratzinger
yes.
wrote a commentary. Ratzinger was cardinal then.
Yes.
And John Paul was, of course, the Pope. So that was a very interesting document as well. That was deliberately published 100 years after Providentismus.
Yes.
So the Church likes to publish things, at 50 or 100-year intervals. So there'll probably be another one in 2043 and 2093. Who knows? But what is that document? That document is kind of interesting because at the time that document was written, the Pontifical Biblical Commission was no longer an official magisterial organ. So the PBC, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, used to be comprised of bishops. And so after Leo got it started, it kind of became a sort of enforcement mechanism for the magisterium to sort of crack down on various trends in biblical scholarship, around the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and so forth. So some of the positions that, are more or less taken for granted today, like the idea that Mark was the first gospel, like the idea that Moses didn't literally write the whole Pentateuch, which most, everyone believes today, not everybody, but certainly a large majority. These positions would have, were kind of suppressed by the PBC in the early part of the century. But by 1993, the PBC had really evolved into mostly scholars, many of whom were churchmen also, but mostly scholars, and their role was less to sort of be a magisterial enforcer, but more kind of a go-between between the magisterium on the one hand and biblical scholars on the other hand. So that's kind of what the purpose of that document was, as I see it. It's kind of like a, it's not so much you can do this, you can't do that. It's more like, here's the way standard Catholic exegetes are plying their trade, and here's some good in it, here's some bad in it, and here's kind of how this would relate to the magisterium. So in other words, it's kind of a quasi-magisterial document in that JP2 blessed it. Ratzinger wrote a big foreword to it and did a speech before it when it was released, but it's sort of, there's enough distance between it that it's not exactly praising anything or condemning anything so much as it is just short of showing, this is kind of how it's going as a result of 50 years after Divino and, 30 some years after Vatican II when it was released, something like that. So you certainly don't have to read the whole document. It's kind of long. I want you to know that it exists. I want you to know that there's been a lot of commentary on that particular document. There's a lot we could say about that document, some of which you've kind of already said. So in other words, if you read through the first part of it, you'll recognize a lot of the things that I've taught you in the earlier lessons, being sort of praised on the one hand and saying, well, here's the shortcoming of it on the other hand. So there's a lot of that, arguably, some of the later chapters of the document, which were kind of meant to be climactic, which in some ways were meant to sort of tie together the new approaches with the old approaches, and the latter chapters have maybe not gotten the attention that they deserve. So that's been part of a discussion as well. The church is frequently citing non-Catholic scholars. Most of the scholars cited in this document are non-Catholics, but some of them you've read in this course. And so they're people that you can see that, I whose work I like, even though they're not Catholic. I mean, that, you sort of have to figure out, well, they're not Catholic, so of course they're not going to agree with me in this, but you still are able to take a really good read of the Gospel of Mark here, and here, or something. So that's kind of the interpretation of the Bible in the church. So that's a good document. And then finally, did we do Luke Timothy Johnson this week too? I can't remember. Luke Timothy Johnson was the one that wrote So What's Catholic About It? That's that little article. Or no, we're going to do it next week maybe.
That I don't remember.
Okay, maybe we'll do it next week. That's a good one to get you ready for. So.
Oh, yes, that's next week.
Yeah.
Johnson, Luke, Timothy, So What's
Catholic? Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so we didn't do that this week. Okay, that's good. So this is just kind of the Catholic week of getting us up to close to the modern period. And sort of showing for good or for ill, what's kind of been the discussion of the Bible in the 20th and 21st centuries. So, that's mainly what we're talking about.
Good.
Yeah. So,
Great.
Dwayne, I know what you're doing for your paper, right? You talked to me, but Sue Ellen, what are you going to do? Did you talk to me or not?
I haven't gotten to talk to you yet. I'm kind of in the middle of a quandary between two subjects.
Okay.
So
all right.
I'm thinking about, I like the idea of working on the inerrancy of the scripture portion that we got, but I'm not sure exactly how to define that small enough to make it a deep paper without being too much, generalization.
Right. Okay.
I'm working on getting that to you then.
Okay. That's a good one. So probably what you should do there, if you're going to do that, is get the commentary by Alois Gromeyer on Dei Verbum 11 and 12 and 13, which are the parts of Dei Verbum that deal specifically with inerrancy. And that's sort of the church's most recent and fullest sort of statement on inerrancy, and nothing really has come after that deals with the topic. But there were quite a bit of things that came before that. Like, so Divino deals with inerrancy to some extent. So you probably, if you wanted to do this topic, you should read Divino. And you could also read Providentissimus, because both of those deal with inerrancy also.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And I think that I gave you Ignace de la Poterie in like the first or second week of the course. You could look at his article as well. That would be good.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And then the thing is that you would if you just do some writing, you can kind of capture the debate. The debate is kind of between I would sort of characterize the debate as between sort of radical modernists on the one hand, who think that the Bible is full of errors, and then on the other hand, the fundamentalist position that thinks that there's no errors in the Bible, and understand that to mean that any type of inconsistency or inconsistency or anything like that can somehow be explained away by some kind of a harmonization or something like that. And I would, my own view is I think the truth would kind of go in between those extremes that we would want to avoid. So that would be a good approach to take. And so
all right.
I think you'll find some things. So
excuse me, what was the name? The Alois Gromeyer? Is that what you said the name was?
Alois Gromeyer. It's in the Vorgrimler series of Vatican II commentaries. I'll tell you what, if you decide to do this and you can't do it and you can't find that, ask Sister Rebecca if she would retrieve it for you, because I'm sure they have the Vorgrimler's commentary series on Vatican II
Yes, sir.
in her library where she is, and she's in Meinrad, Indiana, so she would have it at St. Meinrad's, I think.
All right.
See if she will photocopy it for you. Do you remember the Ratzinger commentary that you read, like in the first week of the course?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah. So that was from the Four Grimler series, but that was Dave Urban 1 through 10. So Ratzinger wrote Dave Urban 1 through 10. Grillmeyer wrote Dave Urban 11 through 13, and so that's the one you would want to look at.
All right, we read that. I remember that now. Okay.
Yeah, and you might also, I don't know if you want to get into historicity of the Gospels too. That might be a direction you could take as well. Although that almost would be a different topic, but that could be a different way of approaching it. And then you could look at Santa Mater Ecclesia,
Yes, sir.
which is the document that was released with Vatican II on the historicity of the Gospels. And there's been a lot of commentary on that as well. And then there's another section of Dave Urban that deals with that, which is Dave Urban, paragraph 19, I believe, either 19, 20, or 21, one of those.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right.
You're
Welcome.
Thank you. Great.
Hi, Sarah. We're getting ready to the old discussion here.
Hey, I'm glad
Hi.
I got you guys.
Okay. Yeah. We're not your class. We're waiting for your class. Your class is going to start in a few minutes, so you're a little early.
Oh, yeah, I am
Yeah.
early. I'm 5
Okay.
minutes. I guess I could hang up.
Yeah. You
Are
can
you-
hang out if you want. That's fine. But just, yeah. So we're talking about something else.
Not about papers.
Yeah, we are, but in a different course. So, but yeah, you can still listen if you want, though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Well, recruiter for this class.
So anyway, yeah. So inerrancy would be a good topic, I think.
I think it would be a good one too. I was trying to just figure out how to make it, as I mentioned, just make it a worthwhile discussion.
Right.
My other thought was to get into Martin Luther and such, and that's why I was researching his languages and things. And then, of course,
Okay,
Bultmann
okay.
really interests me, but I don't know what to do with him. So I'm just going
Right.
to read and learn from him.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good.
But thanks for the ideas. I appreciate it.
All right. So good. So what else? And any other questions, Dwayne?
No, I don't, not that I can think of, no.
Okay.
I think I'm gonna head on out then,
Okay.
and I sure appreciate the video chat.
Very good. It's fun. Yeah, I enjoy it. So always a pleasure. So I will see you guys both on the forum, and I
Okay,
guess Thanksgiving is next week, so I'm thinking we probably won't do one next week.
Okay.
okay,
But have a happy Thanksgiving, and I'll see you probably on the forum, and then in the week after maybe.
okay, great.
All right.
Happy Thanksgiving to
Happy
everybody.
Thanksgiving. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. All right. So Sarah, what I'm going to do is log off and log back on again, so I can start a new recording. Okay. So that these aren't one long thing. Okay. So I'll be right back. Okay.
Okay. Do you need
All
me
right.
to log off?
Yeah, I'm going to log off, or at least, yeah. Let me. Yeah.
Okay. Let me figure
Yeah.
out how to do
I'll
this.
come back. Okay. Don't worry.